McDonald. I'm a rehabilitation officer for the visually impaired, but at the moment I've been doing some research on how visually impaired students make sense of science diagrams. One of the things I noticed was that even though the teachers were actively attempting to help visually impaired students make sense of the diagrams by adapting those diagrams or providing support assistance, they didn't necessarily provide the same level of information to the visually impaired student or the same insight that the sighted students were getting from the original diagrams. Let me explain. One of the observations I made was when they were looking at phases of the moon, and the visually impaired student had his diagram enlarged so that he could see it, and he also had his own teaching assistant. The rest of the class had the original material. Their diagrams were in 2 rows of 4 moons, and they could see a pattern between the 2 rows. Unfortunately, the enlarged diagram had 3 rows of 2 or 3 moons, so there was no pattern for him to recognize. So automatically he was at a disadvantage. He didn't have that information available. The teaching assistant also told me that this was her least favourite subject. So she said that she wasn't able to explain to him about the phases of the moon because she didn't understand it herself. So whilst the teacher was going around the classroom helping all the other students who were struggling, the teacher assumed that the teaching assistant was dealing with the visually impaired student and that they were fine. Another example was when in a mainstream school they were looking at the universe. They would be split into pairs of students, mark dots on the balloon, measure the distances between those dots, and then blow up the balloon and measure the distances again. With the visually impaired student, he was with a teaching assistant who did all of that for him. So the student sat there and listened to her description of what she did and what she saw. So the student's learning was based on what the teaching assistant told him of what she saw and did, whereas all the other students' learning was based on their own participation and their own inferences. And a third example was a visually impaired student told me in a mainstream school that she needed to have a teaching assistant not just in class but also between classes, because she had to carry a lot of heavy equipment around. Plus they were given a room that had a large computer in it so they could access material that way. And this, she said, made her feel isolated from her peers. She never had the opportunity to socially interact with her peers because she was always with her teaching assistant. So at this student's request, she was reassessed, and the school and the student agreed on a new support system whereby she was given a laptop which had both Wi-Fi and audio description on. Now she was able to sit anywhere in the classroom and be able to access the whiteboard that the teacher was teaching from. The teaching assistant was available if she needed it, but she was able to sit with her peers. Also, she had less to carry around, so she was actually able to walk between lessons with her peers and needed less time in the designated room. So her social interaction improved a great deal. It is important that assessments are carried out to find out what the individual needs are. It's not just purely academic. It's also about educating these young people to become adults who will become socially able to interact. Don't assume that just by making a diagram larger or by providing a support assistant that you are providing that student with the same level of information as a sighted student with the original material. You need to do an assessment of the individual's needs. You need to establish what message you're trying to deliver with any material. So for instance, with the moons, if it was established that there was a pattern and that was part of the learning that was going to be taught, as well as enlarging it, it could have been done in landscape format as opposed to portrait. If it was done in landscape, you would still be being able to have that pattern of 2 rows. They're not always simple, the solutions, but in looking at the purpose of a diagram and identifying the needs, you're actually helping yourself as a teacher to focus on what it is you're trying to teach the class as a whole. So in effect, you are improving what you are teaching the whole class, and that's what I would class as inclusive education. What you're doing for a visually impaired student actually benefits all of the students. Don't assume though that if you just download accessible diagrams that will be appropriate for your individual student. It might not tie in exactly with the material you're using. It might not suit that individual's needs. More often than not, you'll have to produce the materials yourself. may mean removing unnecessary details or words, using a different vocabulary even, but it'll help you to focus on what it is you're trying to deliver. Also, visually impaired student will take a lot longer to navigate and read a diagram, especially a larger diagram. So if you're giving them all the same amount of time to digest some information, the visually impaired student will take in less than a sighted student because it takes them longer to find their way around that information. Hopefully I've given you an idea as to why it's so important to assess an individual, to establish what it is you're trying to get across, and it's important not just to the visually impaired student but as a whole.